an operator. Robert Kaplan's new book, The Nothing That Is, A Natural History of Zero, traces where the number originated, as well as its influence to mathematics and our understanding of the universe. Up next, his remarks at the Canterbury Bookstore in Madison, Wisconsin.
Thanks very much. It's such a pleasure to be here. It's such a beautiful store. Most people are, afraid of mathematics or bored by it or hate it. And since I know what fun it is, what sheer fun this game, this only game in town is, I wrote this book to let others in on the secret that all mathematicians know, so that they will see too how this is something made by humans for humans. And it seemed to me that a way into this secret was through the narrow and hollow door of zero, tracing its history and the ideas surrounding it. So here's a bit from my first chapter, chapter 0, of course. I'll read a couple of the sentences that you read, and then that will lead into a few others. That if you look at zero, you see nothing, but look through it and you see the world. Because zero brings into focus the great organic sprawl of mathematics, and mathematics, in turn, the complex nature of things. From counting to calculating, from estimating the odds to knowing exactly when the crests and tides in our affairs move, the shining tools of mathematics let us follow the tacking course that everything takes through everything else, and all of their parts swing on the smallest of pivots, zero. With these mental devices, we make visible the hidden laws controlling the objects around us in their cycles and their swerves. Even the mind itself is mirrored in mathematics, its endless reflections, now confusing, now clarifying thought. Zero's path through time and thought has been as full of intrigue, disguise, and mistaken identity as were the careers of the travelers who first brought it to the West. And I thought what I'd do is just give you a glimpse of some of those bizarre, eccentric, marvelous people who played a part in the story of zero. First, from the 16th century, it took a remarkable man far off in the mists of Scotland to see that by setting equations equal to zero, they could be solved with a single general technique. This man was John Napier, Baron of Merchiston near Edinburgh. When, in the late 1500s, his castle wasn't under siege and he wasn't fighting off raiders on the land and neighbors in the courts, he dabbled in the occult, designed devices of sailing under the water and a round chariot of metal made of the proof of double musket. He bewitched pigeons. He undertook to find buried treasure by sorcery. He deduced in 36 closely reasoned propositions of apocalyptic algebra the relation between prophetic and historical time, and concluded that the last judgment would fall between 1688 and 1700. And he invented logarithms. He was rumored by his neighbors in the early years of the 17th century to be in league with the devil. His dressing all in black, with a jet black cock chained to his wrist as his constant companion, probably did little to dispel these rumors. Napier's magic, however, was of a singularly crafty sort, perhaps because, as Sir Francis Bacon pointed out, histories make men wise, poets witty, but the mathematics subtle. So when it became clear that one of his servants was light-fingered, he assembled them all, so the story goes, and told them that his black cock would discover the thief. He chained it in a darkened room. Each servant had singly to enter, stroke the cock, and emerge. And he caught his man, the only one whose hands were clean, having been afraid to touch the bird which Napier had coated with soot. There was magic behind what Napier did with equations. He would take one that had some terms equal to some others, and by repeated passes of algebra, bring all the terms to the left, leaving only a zero on the right. These were what he called his equations to nothing. And to see why that was such an important thing to do, why that unlocked the secret of how we understand the motion of a thrown ball, how the catenaries of a bridge are hung. For that, you'll have to read some of the book. So let's go back in time to a book written 2,000 years ago in which the Buddha is shown as a young man competing for the hand of Gopa and easily defeating his rivals in wrestling, archery, running, swimming, and writing. Then comes the examination in mathematics. He must name all the numerical ranks beyond a koti, 10 million, each rank being 100 times greater than the last. Gautama answers, Ayuta, Nayuta, Kankara, Vivara, Achobhya, Vivaha, Vatsanga, Bahula, Nagabala, Titilamba, Vaya Vijana Prajnapti, that's 10 to the 31st, and so through the alluring Samaptalamba and the tongue-twisting Vizanjnagati, 10 to the 47th, to Tawakachana, 10 to the 99th at last. But it isn't the last after all. This is a first level only. A second takes him up to 10 to the 99th, and eventually, while the courtiers in their robes and ornaments stand astounded, the ninth brings him to 10 to the 421st. For extra credit, he names all the atoms in a yojana, a league, roughly 3 miles. Seven of the finest atoms make a grain of very fine dust, 7 of which make a little grain of dust. 7 such grains make a mote you can see in a sunbeam. 7 of these a rabbit's grain, 7 rabbit's grains a ram's grain, 7 ram's grain an ox's grain, 7 ox's grains a poppy seed. Compiling by sevens, he goes on to mustard seeds and barley corns and knuckles, 12 of which make a span, 2 spans a cubit, 4 cubits a bow, 1,000 bows a cry in the land of Magadha, and 4 such cries a yojana, or 384,000 times 10 to the 7th atoms in all. And he goes on to number all the atoms in all the lands of the world, known and unknown, and even in the 3 great thousands of worlds. Gautama's reward is not only the hand of Gopa, but the fulfillment of every schoolboy's dream. The examiner prostrates himself before the youth and exclaims, "You, not I, are the master mathematician." Well, these stories, and many more like them, are brightly colored tiles, but there are dark parts to the story of Zero. The Mayan civilization, which flourished in the Yucatan Peninsula in Central America between the 6th and 9th centuries AD, had an immensely intricate system of calendars which were out of sync with one another. And one had 365 days, another had 260. There was a lunar calendar that alternated 29 and 30-day months. One was based on the 584-day cycle of Venus. All of these running at the same time. And 0 days were crucial to their counting. Although theirs is the only culture to have institutionalized such a complex obsession with counting, surely each of us has succumbed at one time or another to its compulsive insistence, telling off the seconds, the cracks in the sidewalk, the patternless holes in the dentist's ceiling tiles. And always what begins in jest ends in earnest, needing no little effort to turn off the machine as we begin to count its counting, to doubt it and double back, to lose our way and wish it done with in vain, until we recognize that servant and master have changed places, and we are no more than the housing for a relentless automaton. Some have reached an accommodation with their monster. Sir Francis Galton, cousin of Darwin and the father of eugenics, counted everything in sight and even had gloves made up for him with pistons that drove 10 separate cylinders so that he could unobtrusively keep track of the percentage of beautiful women in Macedonian villages while tallying up the average price of goods in their shop windows. Others have just given themselves up, like the otherwise lumpish Jedediah Buxton, who, in the 18th century, couldn't help calculating how many hairbreadths wide was every object in his path, and who, when taken to London to see as a treat the great Garrick in a play, announced at its end precisely how many words each character had spoken and how many steps they had taken in their dances. We hear tales linking autism's estrangement with a preternatural fascination with counting. We remember Freud in his old age insisting that rhythmic repetition was the expression of our longing, even beyond pleasure, for sameness, and sameness was the emissary of death. We can't, however, dismiss the Maya as suffering from some sort of collective arithmomania, since it wasn't so much the counts as their coincidings that mattered to them. Their great fear was that time would stop. For since it carried all its suns away to the pulse of the long count, why should their empire, the earth, the sky with its countless stars, and the universe itself not perish as well? To prevent this, they took drastic measures, both clever and horrible. First, they transferred the cyclicity they saw in the heavens to linear time, which therefore couldn't stop in the middle of a cycle, but might yet at its end. Very well, set in motion another cycle out of phase with the first. Now time couldn't stop until both cycles came to an end. And at such evil moments, as every 52 of one kind of their year, they offered up to the gods the essence of vitality, blood, virgins, hearts cut from living victims, that the gods might revive themselves with these and so be willing to pick up again the burden of months put wearily down on 0 days. The trouble with obsessions is that once in their grip, nothing is ever enough. More cycles to put off the danger to yet greater multiples. Nothing is ever enough. Their long count held out the promise that time wouldn't stop for an immense span indeed. A system of dating we find on some of their monuments acted like the service coupons that come with your new car. If there is a voucher for a 50,000-mile checkup, you feel confident that your car will just be coming to maturity then. If there is none at 150,000 miles, a shiver runs through you. This system of theirs seemed to show that they had hardly moved forward from time's beginning in a stretch, by one reckoning, of about 2 times 10 to the 27th years. By comparison, our own culture's Big Bang was a puny 12 or so billion years ago. But like some postmodernist novel of drawers within drawers of a tumble-down desk, even the long count itself became thought of as no longer linear, but as the latest period of these immensely long spans, which had reached cyclically back and would reach cyclically forward forever. It was as if the Maya had taken out insurance policies on their insurance policies. A wonderful advantage lay in rethinking the long count as itself periodic. Not only would the threat of time's cessation diminish, but now the birth of a great ruler could be proven, if your mathematicians were agile enough, to have fallen precisely a significant number of years after, say, the birth of an ancestress. Such good fortune in catching the crest of the polyrhythms was apparently taken to show that the birth was a rebirth. The human Pakal, greatest of all Palenque's rulers, was his divine ancestress. Once you let the analogy A is like B turn into A is B, imagination hardens into the excesses of fantastic conviction, and the catch on the box that stores the demonic snaps open, letting hell loose. I mentioned that the gods of the underworld, the 9 lords of the night, were ruled by the death god, but I didn't tell you who this death god was. He was 0. His was the day when time might stop. His was the end of each lesser and greater cycle. Fearful pause. Now, if a human were found who could take on 0's persona, and if he could be put to ritualistic death, then death would die. And this, it seems, is just what the Maya did. They had a ritual ball game between a player dressed as one of their hero twins and one dressed as the god of 0. The ball was an important hostage, such as a defeated king who had been kept for many years and was now trussed up for the occasion. The 2 players skillfully passed and kicked and beat him to death, or killed him in the end by rolling him down a long flight of stairs. And it was the hero twin who always won by outwitting 0. In other games, the loser was sacrificed, but outwitting death wasn't enough. The human would be dressed in the regalia of the god of 0 and then sacrificed by having his lower jaw torn off. As with most religions, the failure of ritual to achieve its aim didn't alter it, since even the barbarous live in hope. Anthropologists of another generation, following Ruth Benedict, would have called the high culture of the Maya Dionysian. But that, I feel, is a slur on Dionysus. This blood-soaked society, with its glyphic wit, so clever at numbers, so artful in building, so apt at astronomy, remind me of a brilliant and very neurotic friend I once had who appeared one day without his tics and twitches. What had happened? I traded all my neuroses in, he explained, for one little psychosis, and now my life makes sense. True story. Well, let's come back from this darkness to the characters who light up the story of Zero. Something that's always bothered people is the question of whether Zero is out there. Is there an utter vacuum somewhere in space, or is space itself an utter vacuum? Is there beyond space utter nothingness, emptiness? And this question was especially vivid at the turn of our century. You know, that one, the one we're at the end of. So when the orthodox theory of ether held sway, the theory that explained light as waves in an all-pervasive, rarefied medium, you would have expected, given the push-me-pull-you of fashion, that a contrary hypothesis would have arisen which filled up space with celestial ball bearings, and you would have been right. In that corner of the library, where no young and hardly any old codgers go, are stored the books of yesterday's certainties, the delicate charm of their fustiness ruffled only by the ever-modern authority of their tone. Here you will find, almost invisibly wedged away, Osborne Reynolds' slim volume on an inversion of ideas as to the structure of the universe. Its date is 1903, and its writer, an English professor of engineering, assures us that we may have the fullest confidence in his explanations, whose success will achieve, quote, that ideal which, from the time of Thales and Plato, has excited the highest philosophical interest. The reason for his confidence is that his inversion of ideas perfectly explains, he says, the basic phenomena of physics, the absorption and reflection of light, gravitation, and so on. And considering that not one of these phenomena had previously received a mechanical explanation, it appears how indefinitely small, zero a la mode, must be the probability that there should be another structure for the universe which would satisfy the same evidence. And what is his explanation? Why, that there is no empty space, but that the universe is all compact of inconceivably small grains. Their diameters are the 700,000 millionth part of the wavelength of violet light, moving at about 1 1/3 feet per second relative to one another along very short paths. They make up an elastic medium that extends to infinity, and in their piling account for everything we know. Well, may Reynolds ask, could anything be more simple? His theory explains, for example, why the sky is black on a clear night. The motion of light is dissipated to increase the relative motion of the grains. It accounts for gravitation as the result of the particles no longer being closely packed due to inward strains. It even explains what we are, waves in this granular universe. That is what the singular surfaces which we call matter are, waves. We are all waves. Oh, Archimedes, this is wondrous strange. Where are your poppy seeds? And Buddha, your motes that danced in a sunbeam now? A universe in which the void has disappeared. And not only the void, but Osborne Reynolds too. I have in my hand, he writes, the first experimental model universe, a soft India rubber bag. And there is a photograph, his figure 9, of the universe marked W, gripped in a hand that extends from a white cuff, itself shot from a dark sleeve. But the photograph ends before the elbow. There is no more. It is the only likeness I have of Osborne Reynolds and his universe. Well, half a millennium before Osborne Reynolds, questions about zero had a theological setting. I wanted to give you an example of that. A wonderful understanding of this positional zero. Let me explain. The positional zero is the first kind of zero that arose with the Sumerians 5,000 years ago. It's the zero that turns a 1 into a 10 by pushing the one column over to the left, or turns it into 100, 100. This incredible invention, discovery, that allows us to do all the calculating we do. So a wonderful understanding of this positional zero, wholly within the terms of the medieval canon, emerged and flickered briefly in Cologne, early in the 14th century. There, Meister Eckhart, the father of German idealism, a Dominican, a radical mystic, a man who preached in the vernacular with confounding eloquence, taught that all creatures are nothing, that being empty of things is to be full of God, that God, who must lie past all knowledge and all being, must therefore also be nothing, has been immovably disinterested in his creation from the beginning, and still is. And disinterest comes so close to zero that nothing but God is rarefied enough to go into it. Is this a message of stoical resignation in a God-forsaken world? Far from it. Eckhart has a very different vision in mind, a vision in which he sees that he is God, and that anyone will be God if he goes beyond humility to disinterest. In the course of delivering one of his last sermons, he announces the truth which that moment was discovered to him. God and I are one. Now I am what I was, and I neither add to nor subtract from anything, for I am the unmoved mover that moves all things. And that, of course, is just what zero is. But zero has worked powerfully on the human imagination in many ways. It's at the heart of our timekeeping, of our calendars, and its shadow keeps falling, as it has very recently in the past month, the past year, on questions of the end of time, of Judgment Day. This is from a section of the book called This Year, Next Year, Sometime, Never. As the centuries heaped up, it became increasingly important to know when the world would end. Roman-style counting confused the issue, since there was no year zero between 1 BC and 1 AD. Hence, millennialists had to reckon then, as they do now, with the difficulty that years ending in zero were the last of their decade, century, or millennium, not the first of the next. So for us, January 1st of 2001 begins the third millennium, and the festivities of the year before celebrate only private rites of passage. Despite numerous calendrical reforms, it wasn't until 1740 that a year zero hesitantly made its appearance, when Jacques Cassini, the second of 4 generations of Italian astronomers in charge of the observatory at Paris, published his Table Astronomique with this rectification. To know when the end would be. For this, you needed to date exactly the relevant beginning and understand what span of after-time was ordained. This is why such efforts of exegesis and calculation went into establishing Christian chronology, whose purpose had ever been to date not the beginning, but the end. We have seen these calculations, for all the precision with which they were made, miscarry time after time. The Doukhobors burned down their houses with all their worldly goods the night before recurrent judgment days. People stood with their prophets at dawn in mountain meadows, only to trudge disappointed home again at dusk. Hail Bop came and went. Yet these crushing disappointments left behind residues of incalculable value, an altered sense of time, an awakened eye for history. Dies irae, dies illa, solvet cyclum in favilla, day of wrath, that day will crush the year to cinders. If the zero day had safely passed, then time before and time after took on new meaning. Each extended away as the negatives and positives do from zero, now no longer the terminus, but the fulcrum of counting. The past needed closer study for signs of what was to come, and these broken apocalyptic promises led to a discourse that sought to restructure a future with longer temporal horizons. The more distant the day, the more it could be dwelt on in hope. Of course, it shouldn't be so distant as to discourage, nor so near as to disappoint, but should lie in a temperate zone of time, at least a generation away, but no more than 3 or 4. The actual end of time, the day when, as St. John foretold, a small voice would be heard saying, "A measure of wheat for a penny, and 3 measures of barley for a penny," and the heavens would roll up as a shut scroll, and the stars would fall like unripe figs, and the 4 horsemen would be loose in the land. An actual day in 1000 AD, or in 1260. 1533 or 1843. To believe this is to let loose the very real demons within and around us, burning and looting, because there would be no tomorrow. But calmer heads knew that when tomorrow came, the price to pay would be gigantic. Not just to avoid this tearing of the social fabric, but to redirect thought from the word to what it means, from matter to what matters, authoritative voices within the church had long since spoken out against predicting when the apocalypse was to be. As early as Matthew and Mark, we are told that not even the angels know this date. St. Augustine, and after him a whole tradition of writers, including Bede, worked in a variety of ways to put the dreaded day off or aside. Different systems of reckoning from different datum lines were conjured up. Errors were found in calculations that brought the moment too near. Cleverest of all, as with that fascinating monk, forger, and historian Adhemar of Chabannes, who wrote in the millennial generation between 1000 and 1033, chronology was deliberately allowed to become vague around pointers to the critical time. Adhemar substituted expressions such as "in those days" and "after a while" for the precise dates in the annals that he was copying. Well, to end with, I'd like to look with you not at the mathematical zero, but at a kind of zero that always haunts us. Zero is neither negative nor positive, but the narrowest of no man's lands between those two kingdoms. Yet, our analogy-driven minds, ever eager to read expressions on neutral faces, seize on its emptiness and make out powers and portents there. You saw how, in the Middle Ages, zero was taken as devil's work, or the devil himself, the great canceller of meaning. How easy to think of yourself dismissed as a good-for-nothing, a no account. The Sultan Abdul Hamid II, perpetrator of the terrible 19th century Armenian massacres, had his censors, they say, remove any reference to H2O from chemistry books entering his empire, convinced that the symbol stood for Hamid II is nothing. How easy still to dismiss those we reject as mere zeros, sinks of energy, black holes in which all that matters, the singular and the memory of the singular, disappear without a trace. It is as if that hollow oval stood for anonymity, mirroring our fear of making no difference to others, to anyone, to the world. How many zeros, it turns out, you've met and even kidded around with, those faces in old yearbooks you now can't put a name to, those names in old address books that summon up no features. They made up the crowd into which sometimes you yourself loved to plunge as a mere spectator, until the chilling thought came of your own name as unrecognizable in tattered address books lying in basement drawers. To live as a zero, the superfluous man, the man without qualities, the person who, like Henry James's John Marcher, finds out only too late that the beast in his jungle was that there was no beast, no response to passion. This figure haunts our fiction and our fact, the salaryman of Japanese society, the company man, the fungible folk of our office culture who retreat to virtual reality games at home. The worst of it is that, unlike Marcher, most never awake to the truth that they haven't lived. This was le néant, the nothingness at the heart of existentialism, the rare recognition of which brought nausea, and so a moment in which to choose what you would be, since all choices, being choices, were equally unnecessitated, equally arbitrary, equally without prior meaning. You began to exist with this random choice embraced as random, and in living it out you made your essence. So an arbitrary digit slipped in front of a string of zeros creates value where none had been. But Sartre died, and his authenticity died soon after, as pipe and scarf and the deux magots came to seem the self-publicizing tactics of a literary man. The fashion for existentialism passed, preserved now only in successive waves of adolescence before the getting and the spending set in. Well, this negative zero has a positive counterpart, and I'll end my reading with that. This zero lies always at the beginning of ongoing time. It is the American zero. You catch a glimpse of it in our road novels. Oh, look, says Lolita, at the moment of metamorphosis, beside her Humbert in their cocoon of a car. All the nines are changing into the next thousand. You hear it from people who still wake themselves with the thought, today is the first day of the rest of my life. It is the zero of a society defined by its frontier. And as successive terminal moraines result from successive glaciations, so each frontier leaves its traces behind it. Frederick Jackson Turner wrote that in 1893. The traces he lists of the American frontier include coarseness and strength, exuberance, inventiveness, selfishness, and individualism, an excessive love of liberty, and a deficient love of education. Certainly we never learn from history because each of us knows, like the hero of Thomas Wolfe's Look Homeward Angel, that our chosen incandescence was born in upon the very spearhead of history. Turner lamented the closing of the frontier 100 years ago, but it never closed. It isn't just that frontiers have opened up since in space or society or technology, but that we all live on the moving margin. We stand like Jefferson at our Palladian windows looking out at the wilderness. Cyclic time is foreign to us. Linear time, with a past as long as a future, riles our ornery natures. America is the land of zero, said the philosopher Joseph Needleman. Start from zero, we start from nothing. That is the idea of America. We start only from our own reason, our own longing, our own search. And Rimbaud, for all that he was French, gave us our epigraph, always arriving, you will go everywhere. Thank you. Thanks very much. Questions, answers? Anything you'd like to ask about, zero? Or nothing? Yes.
What does that mean?
I was hoping someone would ask. Thank you. The book is fair. The answer is contained somewhere in it. It's like those, puzzles in newspapers with the answer upside down. This is buried right side up. Anyone recognize Frank Brimsek? No. Frank Brimsek. I'll give you a hint. Sports. Hockey. 3 hours, 51 minutes, 54 seconds. Sounds like the length of time that a goalie has shut out his opponents. Frank Brimsek was the goalie for the Boston Bruins in their great 1938-39 season. When he held the opposition scoreless for that length of time, he had other scoreless victories, and as a result of which he was called Mr. Zero. And to whom else could I dedicate the book? But that's the only secret I'm going to give away. What can I tell you about nothing?
What sort of problem did the Greeks have with this?
This is the strangest story. The Sumerians invented zero. Some Sumerian bookkeeper, wanting to distinguish between 102, let's say, and 12 in keeping accounts at the temple of contributions to the temple, put two little diagonal wedges, cuneiform wedges, horizontal ones, in between the symbol for 1 and 2 to indicate no number in this column, so that you understood this wasn't 12 but 102. And then the Sumerians used this zero in a positional way. The Babylonians picked it up from them. Alexander, when he invaded the Babylonian Empire in 331 BC, picked it up and took it with gold and women back to Greece. But there it disappeared. It went underground for a variety of strange, interesting reasons. It only appears in Greek writing in the astronomers, some of them, and the astrologers, in Ptolemy, to indicate, for example, if you wanted to say 54 degrees, no minutes, 7 seconds, he would have a little superscripted zero to indicate no minutes. The Romans don't have it, as you know. It just goes out of sight. It reemerges in India in the 6th and 7th centuries AD, where the Indian mathematicians not only recognized the role of zero as a placeholder and the enormous power that gives, but begin to see that it's like a number, that it really is a number. It's through them that zero wins its citizenship in the republic of numbers. Prior to that, well, you wouldn't call a comma or a period one of the letters of the alphabet. It's not that we have 26 letters, oh yes, and then there are these extra letters around. No, they're different. They're dividers, they're markers in some way. And prior to this Indian discovery, zero was thought of as not a number, but a kind of a marker, which, after all, was its major role. The Indians saw you could add, multiply, subtract with zero. You can't divide by it, but everything else you could do. You can't divide by zero. Is that all right with you? Are you convinced that you can't divide by zero? Would you like a proof? It won't hurt, as the dentists say. Oh, let's do a proof. There has to be some real mathematics. This is real mathematics. Give me a number, any number. 72. Give me another number. 19. Do you all agree that 19 and 72 are different? They really, there's just no question they're different. If you could divide by zero, they would be the same. And here's why. 19 times 0 is 0. 72 times 0 is 0. So 19 times 0 equals 72 times 0. Divide both sides by 0, 19 equals 72. So if you're willing to have all numbers be the same, then you can divide by 0. Otherwise, you can't.
What about dividing 0 by 0?
A mathematician in the audience. That's the one thing you have to be very, very careful about. That's a modest way of saying you can't do it, you shouldn't do it. It's a big issue. There's a way in calculus by something called L'Hopital's rule, because it was not invented by a man named L'Hopital, but by his teacher Bernoulli, and he stole it from him. The story is in the book. There's a way of making the symbol 0 over 0 actually stand for something under special circumstances when you're comparing the slopes of two curves. But otherwise, 0 over 0 doesn't mean much, which is a way of saying it doesn't mean anything. Or it means nothing. I guess that'd be the appropriate way to say it. Did I see a hand? Yes.
Well, if you subtracted, say, 3 from 3, how would that be different from 0? I mean, Sumerians would say, well, I got 3 cows and I'm going to sell them, and what do they have left?
Good. They must have been aware of this taking away image that 3 cows lent to a neighbor leaves you with no cows, so you're minus 3 cows that you formerly had. So certainly 3 minus 3 would be, I think they probably didn't think of it as a number, but as a transaction. And it wasn't for a long time, I think because one's a little in awe of that symbol. Shakespeare says, the poet gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name, but giving to nothing something, to make it something, it just doesn't sound right. So to say 3 minus 3 is 0, that it actually is nothing, takes a huge jump of abstraction, which we now feel so comfortable with because we have all this history, despite what I last read in the book, behind us, and we've come to feel comfortable with it. But ask a 5-year-old, and a 5-year-old will remind you that 3 minus 3 is just illegitimate, much less 3 minus 4. Yes, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I was curious what the etymology of the word 0 is, though. I'm sure you go into the book, but I haven't read
It is absolutely fascinating. Goes back to the word shunya, the Indian word for nothing, picked up by the Arabs when they brought 0 to the West and turned it into shifr, or ash-shifr. And then once in the West, here's the family tree of 0 in my wife's drawing. So shifr turns into cipher. Cipher in one line of its development through Germany and into England. In Italy, it becomes zephyr. By the time that zephyr blows across the mountains to Venice, it turns into zero, our 0, with many different variations on this. There are other roots, null, the Latin nulla, which turns into null, some Hebrew influences here and there, but basically our 0 has blown over the mountains to Venice from the Arab wind that brought zero to the West. Yes?
Related to the first two questions, did you have anything else you wanted to say about the comparison of the history of zero to the history of nothing?
That's a big, big question. I'd love to answer it in full. I hope I've said something about that in here. They certainly are different notions. Zero as a mathematical entity, whether it's an object, a noun, the number zero, or whether, as it becomes with calculus, more verb-like, something that one approaches, limits approaching zero. And on the other hand, this philosophical, psychological, literary notion of a void, not in a mathematical, but in a physical or in a mental realm. I think they're interrelated, and I think that our tendency to read analogies in everything, such a wonderful tendency, Kepler said it was his greatest guide, analogy, so pernicious at times, causes us to confuse the two, zero and nothing, but the confusion is often helpful, so that we begin to see that zero as a number between the negatives and positives can also act as the balance point in double entry bookkeeping, which is how it becomes legitimated in the West, that the equilibrium of debts and credits, to go back to your 3 minus 3, has a financial, an economic, and a mathematical meaning, which begins to put at least those two aspects together. But I think you're asking more about the nothing of existentialism, let's say. Is that the sort of thing you had in mind?
You're welcome to go with it in any direction.
Okay.
What you're bringing up is some things about, say, how the societies are developing and being able to have this concept of nothing. And that actually came at some point far before zero, which, as you're saying with the bookkeeping, perhaps it did because this person realized that there was nothing for the second placeholder, even though he had the first and last number.
Yes, I wager that just as in each person's life, the notion of nothingness, the fear of nothingness comes at a moment and is devastating and then has to be dealt with, that it must have come up very early in every culture, and one hides from it or one uses it. One makes use of it or one disguises it in one of its many masks. And how the mathematical thought interplays with that, I think, is immensely complex. With this qualification, I do think mathematics is our native language. I think it's our hidden, our buried language that we understand the universe through. It's as if it were the veil between the mind and the world. Spinoza says the structure of the mind and the structure of the world are the same. It's through that veil between the two, that veil of mathematics, that we read each. And I think, therefore, that the mathematical zero isn't estranged from the nothingness that haunts our philosophy and psychology, but is a representative of it. That's an obscure answer. But it's a difficult question. Yes?
I was wondering if the Roman numerals had some of this.
They didn't. It's amazing. Very perplexing. They had no zero. How on earth did their merchants count? Well, my conjecture is, and this goes for the Greeks too, because the Greeks had hardly a zero, what we have in writing is the works of the people who wrote, which is, on the whole, the literary, the educated classes. For the Greeks, their concern in mathematics was geometry. They didn't need numbers there. The merchants, in all those societies, I think did their reckoning with counting boards, where you have columns, and you put pebbles down, and then you, if you have, let's say, 9 in one column, and you add a 10th, you actually take all those away and put one pebble in the column to the left. Those counting boards were sanded. And when you took the pebbles away, what was left was an oval pit. And my conjecture is that that's the source of our symbol for zero. So in this unwritten history of the merchant class, you get the origin of zero, the use of zero, and the way I think the Arabs brought it to the West was in their saddlebags, in the way they reckoned they were so good at doing quick tallies, quick accounts? Good question. It is a very mysterious issue. Yes?
I can't tell if this is an absolutely stupid question or not, but can you have a notion of zero in a non-written culture?
What about this? The Mayans had an enormous number of symbols for zero. Snail shells, cowrie shells, halves of flowers, a man with his head thrown back, a tattoo on his arm, and a necklace around his neck. If that's not writing, if that's a pictographic kind of capturing thought, then yes, they have zero in a non-written language. In one's thought, it seems to me one can do calculations rapidly in one's head where you're not translating them into words, but you're flying through digits. So you're using zero and other numbers there without translating into language. But we're so apt, so eager, so anxious to turn things into words that it's very hard to pull back and see what's happening in thought before the words. I don't think it's a stupid question at all. It's a wonderful question. I wish I had a better answer to it. Yes?
How do you show zero with an abacus?
By having no bead on a line, or having, if you're thinking of the abacus as vertical, having no counter in that column.
But I thought there were beads in the columns all the time.
But you can move them aside. You can move them. You can rearrange. And these counting boards that were used into the Middle Ages and still used in some parts of the world have these wonderful absences, these lacunae, where you say, okay, 3 pebbles here, no pebbles there, 1 pebble there, 103. Yeah.
Could you discuss the parallels between the historical process of the discovery of zero and the process that an individual child goes through in being able to understand the concept?
Oh, that's great. I'd love to do that. Let me preface that by saying that something that my wife Ellen and I have done in Cambridge, Massachusetts, we started in 1994 something called the Math Circle, where we try to have people do mathematics the way it should be done, with fun and with excitement and inventing and getting it wrong most of the time and then excited when it's right. So I'm very alert to how children, I should say our population goes in age from 5 to 57, but we're all kids together. So I'm alert to how people are thinking. I do think that phylogeny recapitulates ontogeny in some ways, that you're seeing in the development of a culture how the mind must come to grips with quantity. And zero is forced on you through debt, through temperature, here certainly, and through the awkwardness of not having it when you're counting, having to make a new symbol for a 10, 11, 12. Eventually you say, there must be an easier way, and then recycling things with a zero. The resistance you find in children when they're 4 and 5 to the notion of subtraction seems to disappear by the time certainly by the time they're 7 or 8. They may just be brainwashed by the culture around them. So it's hard to pick out what the pure process is because we're seeing it in our sophisticated culture. But I do think one is seeing a kind of recapitulation to be read with caution in both directions. Yes?
Is there any instance, I'm thinking that when you talk about an absence over several centuries of the concept of zero, are there instances where that has caused lags in development of science over time because we didn't have proper measurement tools, or?
That's a very good question. I think you see in the Middle Ages, in the early Middle Ages, the halt of that development of Greek thought in Aristotle and Plato lunging toward the scientific, which then is reborn in the early Renaissance. Again, when Arabic traders and scholars bring the Arabic translations of the Greeks to the West, to Italy, you see science reborn, and the pain that many people felt in the Renaissance at having had that huge gap in between. Why weren't these ideas developed in the 300s, 400s, 500s. That might be an analogy. Does that ring true? Were you going to ask? No? Are there other questions? Yes.
Did Pythagoras consider zero at all?
Pythagoras and the Pythagoreans, again going by what little evidence we have, saw the universe made up of whole numbers and their ratios. Zero was not one of them. So the music of the harmony of the spheres, the planets in their proportional distances from the center to one another, man and woman, good and evil, these were all concepts that he and his followers wanted to think of numerically, the entire world seen numerically. By the way, that's something which recurs once double-entry bookkeeping is invented in Italy, where you have to give a value to everything, like goodwill. Everything becomes quantified again. So the Pythagoreans don't have a zero. They don't even have irrational numbers. They have just whole numbers and their ratios until the day when so the story goes, one of Pythagoras' students, Hippasus, came up to him and said, "But Pythagoras, your own theorem that the sum of the squares on the two sides of a right triangle add up in area to the square on the hypotenuse, your own theorem shows that there are numbers which are not the ratios of whole numbers, the square root of 2. And the story seems to continue that they asked Hippasus to kindly step to the edge of this cliff and repeat the proof. But it certainly is true that Greek thought, after the discovery of the irrational, the mathematical irrational, as well as the irrational in passion with Dionysian effects, Greek thought is shattered by that revelation. You would have thought that that shattering would have been a gap through which zero could have entered, but it doesn't. It doesn't enter their thought. It's a great puzzle. Perhaps because their thought was so geometric. Yes?
Do you discuss at all the use of zero in computer science and the idea of the ones and zeros?
Yes. This is phenomenal. That if you think of it, everything in our society now, all the communication, everything we use like telephones and so on, all based on switches which are either on or off. Off, 0, on, 1. Everything can be coded in this binary code so that the pattern, the fabric of our society is reduced to a binary system, not the clumsy 10-base system, which is arbitrary only because we have 10 fingers, not the Sumerian 60, which is cleverer but awkward, but binary. And in fact, that 0 and 1 can be reduced just to 0. You can generate all numbers from 0 alone, giving the lie to King Lear when he said, "Nothing will come of nothing." And if that sounds mysterious, I'll tell you how it can be done. You'll completely understand it, you just won't like it. Think of all the people in this room who have 13 arms. There seem to be none. The set of all people in this room with 13 arms is empty, the empty set. It's a set, it's a perfectly good set, just doesn't happen to have anything in it. Okay so far. Well, associate the number 0 with that empty set. We could say 0 is or stands for the empty set. Now take the set that has the empty set in it. That set has one thing in it, the empty set. So that new set stands for 1. And now take the set that has those two previous things in it, the empty set and the set containing the empty set. That's 2. And in this way, we can generate all numbers from nothing. Yes, I told you wouldn't like it. This idea came up in 1923. Great mathematician John von Neumann, Johnny to his friends and von Neumann to his enemies, came up with this odd formalism, this odd way of deriving all numbers from 0, which just doesn't seem right. There's another way it can be done, which is described in the book, but it's not hard, but it needs pictures, and the pictures are in the book. What's especially odd about this is that in the 19th century, a great German mathematician, Kronecker, said, "God invented the whole numbers, all the rest is the work of man." Well, if von Neumann is right, God invented nothing, and all the rest is the work of man. Back to Meister Eckhart. You were looking particularly puzzled about that, or unhappy about this. Would you like to say why? Yes. Yes.
I'm just wondering, I'm trying to put zero in context with, say, the natural world as opposed to the abstract, and what we make of things, and the kind of constructs that we will arrange to explain things. As you said before, we have the mind, we have the real world, and perhaps mathematics is the veil between which we understand one and the other. And I'm wondering, the division is becoming blurry.
Well, it's a very good point. Because numbers are so hard to understand fundamentally, the great 19th century idea was, well, sets are easy. Everybody understands sets. Let's reduce numbers to sets. You know what a set is. We don't even have to define it. It's so easy. And the attempt to reduce numbers to sets was very successful, but it had the unfortunate, or anyway amusing, consequence that sets became very hard to understand, like having the set of nothing generating everything. All you do is just take the set and then put set brackets around it. That just don't seem right. And there are worse things than this. Great German mathematician named Cantor, I say mathematician, artist, he made the greatest work of art of the 19th century, which is the theory of the infinite. It was he who first allowed us to see how to come to grips with the infinite, that there are many different sizes of infinity. Mathematically, you can say this precisely. He used sets and the notion of sets, and nothing more complicated than the idea of holding hands, pairing things up by holding hands, to allow us to begin to study how sets can grow large and larger. You take all the counting numbers in the world, there are an infinite number of them, and then there's a set with even more things in it. But as those things become clear, or clearer, the sets themselves become vaguer. As I think you were saying, they become blurry. And where we are right now with the infinite and with the notion of sets, I think we are where the Sumerians were 100 years after whoever it was first came up with a symbol for zero. It's taken us 5,000 years to come to grips with zero, and we're doing pretty well with it. The infinite is the great new discovery, the great new toy, the great new subject of inquiry, which someday we will understand as well as we understand zero, or as well as we understand nothing. Well, thank you very much for coming. Wonderful questions.
Thank you very, very much. We have a little gift for you. It's a children's book called Nothing at All. And in it, it's a story about an invisible dog who, by way of magic chance, becomes something after all.
Ah, the nothing that is.
Thank you so much. Those of you who would like
Thank you.
Professor Kaplan to inscribe your books, just form a line around this way, all right, and then we'll be able to see it all. Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you.
Robert Kaplan is the founder of the Math Circle, a program to encourage public awareness and enjoyment of mathematics. He's taught many subjects, including math, Greek, German, and philosophy. Oxford University Press published The Nothing That Is, A Natural History of Zero.